All right. I guess we can start. I'll just introduce myself quickly. I'm Fabrizio Santoro. I'm a research fellow at the International Center for Tax and Development. And this is joint work with Uganda Revenue Authority, my coordinator Ronald from the research department there. Thanks so much for being here, and I hope you'll join. You will enjoy this session. So, small nets for big fish, tax enforcement on the richest in Uganda. Let me start motivating my work. We all know that high-income taxpayers may be literally worth their weight in gold, but we also are somehow aware of the increasing evidence on tax evasion from the richest taxpayers in Africa, worldwide, with strong repercussions on the inequality of the tax system. There is growing literature on the topic. Another important motivation for this work is the fact that personal income tax in Africa is largely underperforming. If you just check the tax to GDP ratio as an indicator for performance, in Africa it's about 2% coming from personal income tax compared to 10% in more developed economies. We also know that most of the personal income tax in Africa comes from pay-as-you-earn, which is taxes on salaries, which are easier to collect. Very little is extracted from capital gains, rental income, professional activities. All this hints to major evasion from such categories. On top of that, property tax in Africa is largely unsuccessful. Again, just comparing indicators for that, you could guess how critical the situation is in Africa. Unsurprisingly, Africa more generally is in extreme need of increasing domestic remobilization, even more so after COVID pandemic, and I would add, even more importantly, equitably, in an equitable manner. So this paper somehow tries to say something about how to raise taxes in a more equitable manner. The key research question for our work is how to enforce compliance on the richest taxpayers in a low capacity settings like Uganda. The international international organizations have suggested to start with a specialized tax office targeting such entities as a first key strategy. Yet there is very, very limited causal evidence on the effectiveness of such strategies. There is a nice literature review from Gangel Torgler, which I would recommend you if you're interested. Most of what we know comes from Europe and the States. Very little is coming now from Latin America. No evidence at all, I would say, from the African continent, at least causal evidence. So we are trying to fill that gap in the literature. It's also true that very few countries in Africa have set up specialized tax offices targeting the wealthy. Some examples come from South Africa, Mauritius, Uganda, of course, Rwanda, something is happening there, Ghana as well. Very few countries in Africa have a specialized unit for the wealthy. We also try, of course, to add to the broader literature on tax audits and taxpayer behavior. There is an audit component to this intervention that I'll tell you in a sec. Yet there is no much consensus even on that in that literature. All right. So let me give you a little bit of information on the context on tax enforcement on the richest taxpayers in Uganda. This paper builds on two earlier papers, more qualitative in nature, which describe widespread tax evasion from the richest taxpayers in Uganda. They are more qualitative, and we try, of course, to piggyback on that. The key intervention that we're evaluating is the launch of the high net worth individuals and very important people unit within the Uganda Revenue Authority in September 2015. So that was the first effort ever, I think, in Uganda in just trying to identify who are the richest taxpayers in the country. I would describe it as a combination of of enforcement, persuasion, taxpayer assistance, and scrutiny of information. The unit, which was largely understaffed, was carrying on a bunch of different activities, which, touch on all these different aspects. The paper before ours hints at some positive qualitative evidence, which of such units, which we somehow tend to make more accurate, with a more, causal, estimation strategy. One interesting thing is that the way they identify the richest taxpayers in Uganda was to set up some 8 parameters, looking at, for instance, land ownership, import-exports, car ownership, loans from financial institutions. It was really the first effort in using data from other institutions and try to identify the wealthy. So it's remarkable in itself. Yet we don't know much. I mean, as I'll show you in a bit, impacts are somehow mixed. So I'll tell you a little bit more about our treatment and control groups. We do an analysis at the individual level and at the corporate level, as I'll tell you in a bit. At the individual level, the unit was targeting about 400 individuals, split by 157 high net worth individuals, and the rest are very important people. That's what we call the treatment group. Now, who are these HNWIs? These are the economic elites, are extremely wealthy individuals engaging in economic activities, holding companies, being directors of multiple companies, having often complex transactions in the economy. Very important people instead are totally different animals. They are politicians, from the head of the state to ministries, to prominent people that are just rich by themselves, by inheritance, and they are visibly and generally known to be rich. So they are very different categories. They were put together in the same sort of intervention. We somehow test the impacts on both of them. Of course, they are very different from the broader taxpayer population. As I said, HNWIs are more in trading. They're registered for VAT and pay as you earn. They're more, they're holding companies. VAPs instead are more likely to have wealth in vehicles and lands and property. Interestingly, and likely for us, I think, was that at the time we did the study, the URA identified 1,700 potential HNWIs and VAPs. So there was a separate list using the same criteria that URA put there, but never actually treated due to challenges in capacity, of course. As I said, 6 staff for 400 individuals is already challenging. There was this separate list of potential wealthy that we use as a control. They're never actually treated. Thanks to the URA data, we're also trying to link such individuals with their companies. And I think it's a nice contribution of our work, trying to, study compliance pattern at the individual level and the corporate level at the same time. So we realized that there are companies associated with such wealthy, about 850 companies connected either to the HNWIs or the VAPs. Likewise, there are about 2,000 companies connected to these potential HNWIs, VAPs, which we use as control. So these are like the setting in terms of groups. The treatment group are those 400 individuals which are actually treated, and the control is the 1,700, which never heard about the unit, never got in touch with the URA through the unit, so they are somehow untreated. So in terms of data sources, we rely on a wealth of administrative data from the Uganda Revenue Authority. These are taxpayer level data, highly sensitive. URA kindly shared with us data on personal income tax and VAT returns and payments, and of course data on corporate income tax filed by companies and VAT returns and their payments. So thanks to such granular information, we're able to assess the impacts at the taxpayer level, at the individual level, and companies. Of course, we also run a series of in-depth interviews to get some more qualitative evidence. In the paper, we add lots of such qualitative nuances to our story. All right. The estimation strategy is quite straightforward. We exploit the variation of the intervention across time and groups. As I said, September 2015 is when the unit is officially launched. There was a specific group which was targeted, those 400 individuals, and then we got the control group which was untargeted, which is represented by those 1,700 individuals. So we thought of a straightforward, standard diff and diff strategy. We strengthened such strategy with a propensity score matching, which is done before running a diff and diff. We use data before the launch of the unit, so sort of, ex ante, kind of before the actual intervention, to match in the treated individuals in the treated group and those in the potential list. That's the main specification looks like this. The interaction term post times treat is what we have to look at. So all of the results in the paper are basically a series of diff and diff tables where the key, where the key impacts are given by the delta there. In the paper, we also say something about the parallel trend assumptions. It seems to hold, especially after matching. So we are somehow confident that we are getting causal impacts there. I think I have 10 minutes to go through the results. Let's start from the filing behavior of individuals. So what we see is that income tax compliance improves at the extensive margin only, and only for VAPs. So you will see here throughout this session that results are quite mixed. They work for some categories, but they don't work for the other. If VAPs do well, HNWIs backfire, and vice versa. In this case, when it comes to filing, the probability of filing a return, VAPs are doing well. And just to show you one of those standard tables. In columns 1 and 2, we pull together HNWIs and VAPs, and then we disaggregate by them. So the first line, the interaction term, as you can see, is strong and strongly significant for VAPs only. There is a significant jump in the probability of filing a return for such individuals compared to a very low control mean. So this is some positive results. When we look at the intensive margin, so conditional filing, what they actually declare, we see a strong appearing small response for both groups. We see that income decreases, sales decreases, expenses, depreciation fall as well. At the end of the day, the final tax liability decreases by a sizable 27%. So it's an extremely negative impact on the actual revenue collected. Same story with VAT, as we show in the paper. At this point, we also look at payment behavior. Very chaotic response there on payments, totally disconnected from returns, which is something that is more and more documented in the literature. Taxpayers file in a way and they pay in a totally different way, not much connected. We show that the total payments are unchanged, apart from some minor increase for HNWIs. VAPs improve on the income tax payments only. But then if we consider all the different components, rental income tax, withholding, pay as you earn, all that goes down. So not such a, it's again, we were very puzzled to see such results. I'll say something more towards the end. Now, what about companies? We run the same specification on companies. We see a negative effect on the probability to file a corporate income tax returns for companies. There is some positive evidence on the probability to zero file, meaning that treated companies are less likely to zero file. They file a non-zero turnover, yet in terms conditionally on that, the business income doesn't change. We see the same reaction in terms of cutting down expenses. Bottom line is that the total tax payable, yes, is increases, but not significantly. So we are not comfortable in saying that companies react positively in terms of compliance. There is no change in employment, in the size of the companies. So that means that this shift that we see is all due to reporting behavior. rather than their growth. We also say something about the payments of such companies. Again, very chaotic, mixed response across categories. On one hand, VAPs companies pay more corporate income tax, but less withholding. HNWIs pay more rental income, but less VAT. Again, at the end of the day, the total tax payments don't change. All this, and I'm happy to hear your views as well, may indicate the presence of complex tax avoidance schemes against which the URA was not well equipped to do anything. So at the end of the day, there is not much improvement in filing and payments. In the paper, we also try to say something about the key mechanisms at play, and we link to the literature. As you know, probably deterrence is one of the first key factor explaining compliance. We try to say something about the deterrent role of the unit on the traded individuals. We use audit data, so we match our sample with audit data. First of all, we realized that audits are extremely low. Official audits are extremely low. Only HNWIs got audited. VAPs were not officially audited. And yet we can show that those improvements that I showed you, those minor improvements that I showed you before, come mostly from audited HNWIs. In terms of filing, for payments, results do not change. Then, of course, we want to say something about the facilitation or taxpayer assistance component of such intervention. And we are quite comfortable in saying that this was working a lot with very important peoples, which are less knowledgeable of the tax system. They are, as I said, politicians or religious leaders, ethnic leaders, much less knowledgeable. We show that, we interpret that positive impact on the probability to file a return as a key, as a hint that the facilitation channel was working for such category. Albeit we don't find anything on no impacts on the probability to file on time, which is another proxy for compliance costs. So again, here facilitation seems to work more for VAPs. Another element, another mechanism that we think is at play here is about peer pressure and social shaming, especially for very important people. As most of them politicians, the URA was playing this card of disclosing their names through media to push them to file, especially during election periods. They were compelled to file, so to show to the citizens that they were complying. So there's also this element. At the end of the day, HNWIs, the tax sophisticated entities react more to deterrence. Very important people react more to facilitation and peer pressure. Okay, I think I can just now conclude. Just a quick summary, very chaotic response, which finds us quite puzzled. As I said, on the individual level, there is an improvement at the extensive margin of compliance, the probability to file. Yet we see a quite concerning, appearing small response. This has been documented also elsewhere in the literature. It's nothing new to us, but still we weren't expecting. Payments at individual level follow a totally disconnected pattern. When it comes to companies, we see a negative impact on the probability to file a return, more income and cutting expenses. The final liability doesn't change. And again, payments follow a totally disconnected pattern. The bottom line, I think, is that these two categories react very differently. And when it comes to the policy recommendation, I could say something about that. Last slide. This unit, I think, represents for sure a promising opportunity to start thinking about the best way to tax the richest taxpayer. Very few countries in Africa have that. For sure, it was a remarkable success in identifying such individuals and pushing them to file, to comply a little bit, at least. Yet there are big challenges that which we somehow categorize this way. There are technical challenges in tackling such quite sophisticated tax avoidance schemes. the array it seemed to us that it was not perfectly equipped to do that. There was very little understanding on how avoidance takes place between individual and corporate tax accounts. Two different offices were working on the two accounts separately. Yes, there was one single unit for two categories, which probably was not the best way. More targeted solutions probably could have worked better. More resources are needed. As I said, political barriers, of course, are still there. It's a very kind of sensitive and delicate effort, and everyone is aware that politics plays a big role. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Santoro, for the elaborate and passionate presentation. At some point listening in, I thought you were Ugandan. So I'll be discussing the paper. I'm Enock, Bulime, student at Richest University. Firstly, I find the study to be highly relevant, practical to the policymakers and to the public and academics alike, because it highlights the importance of taxes, importance of taxation of the wealthiest individuals in society because of the increase in tax revenues that are critical for financing the development aspirations of these countries. It also highlights that the literature, especially empirical literature, focuses on low-income countries is scanty, yet there are high levels of tax avoidance by the rich, which results in lower revenues. And the broader research question that I find is does enhanced tax administration reduce tax evasion and avoidance by the wealthy directly impact revenue mobilization? And the answer, as you have heard, is not a simple yes or no answer. So it follows the creation of a specialized tax office in the Uganda Revenue Authority to monitor the tax affairs of the richest individuals and measures the causal impacts of the increased enforcement levels of the compliance of the wealthy. The key findings have been emphasized by the presenter, and the key contributions to both literature and policy have also been emphasized in the paper. What are some of the comments that I make from my reading? Firstly, the study seems to move between wealthy and rich, but from my understanding, these two terms might mean different things to different people. So it would be good if there is consistency in definition of who the wealthy are, and also the criteria. You point us to another study to find the criteria that you use, but it's good if this is explicitly put out in the paper as you have presented. And then also the concept of being wealthy or rich is evolving, and therefore you need to take that into consideration and how this might affect the sample size and the findings of your study, given that there's also entry and exit within the wealthy category. And you might have noticed that the control group was a fixed one. So the treatment group was a fixed group over the years. So yet there could have been possibility of entry and exit out of this category. Then you mentioned that the unit has put in place a number of soft actions to facilitate compliance. And as you have seen, the results have been not as great as you would have expected. And this might be a case of a cutting gloves approach where the cutting gloves cut is normal, so you don't get as much effect as you would have expected. And then you emphasize that the net in your topic, that the net is perhaps small, but I think the net is also weak, given the findings that you have presented. And then in the overview, you present an overview of the tax enforcement for the private individuals, but you don't provide one on the companies, yet you go ahead to provide the spillover effects to the companies. So it would be prudent for us picked that as well from the paper. And then regarding the key informant interviews that you held, these improve your findings, but it would have been prudent to also consider having interactions with other key actors in this tax avoidance area. Looking at the staff, looking at the individuals that you tag as VIPs or the high net worth individuals, discussions with them would also have improved this paper and its findings. It would also be important to see what these individuals think about this specialized tax unit. You know, they might actually ask the question, who made you ruler or judge over us? Because you might find that URA individuals might also fall in this category of either the high wealth, high net worth individuals, but perhaps they're not included in this. And then might they also not be guilty of the same offenses that they might be charging these individuals with? And then who audits? The auditors. Who's auditing URA officials? Because some of them might actually fall in that category. And then from the policy perspective, to be prudent to have more concrete recommendations. For instance, you mentioned that the staffing, there are 6 staff who are inadequate to undertake this momentous task, but to be prudent to highlight how many staff might be required by URA, and then what is the required skill set? You just speak of their skills gaps. And then question, could it be that these high net worth individuals or VIPs are also benefiting from tax exemptions, and this could also have affected the results of your study? Thank you very much.
Please. We have room for questions, please.
You said at the beginning that tax collection was ineffective historically. And that could be because the tax rates are low, could be because the potential tax base is smaller, or it could be because the effective tax base is much smaller than the potential people evading. Your solution seems to be most designed to address the third problem. Yes, but maybe I'd like to get back to you again after. If there is any other questions from the crowd.
Just out of curiosity, how unequal is the Ugandan society?
Sorry,
how unequal the inequality in Uganda, and the share of VIPs, right, with respect to GDP, how big does that play a role, and are they involved into international companies?
You mean the share of
the VIPs, like, how much are they with respect to the GDP of the country, for instance? How much wealth do they own in the whole country that they play? Right? And also, are they involved into, international companies as well?
I see. Thank you. Anything else? Yes.
I would also love, very cool work, and I would also love to know more about like the mandates and the tactics of this team. Just because I feel like, if you're someone who wants to demand bribes, there's no better place for you than being on this team, if it actually is toothless and lacks incentives, right? And so, if it's just a case that getting assigned to this team where you know all about the rich people's money, if that's like a promotion, because it allows you to extract more bribes.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Please.
Yeah, it was a question on. You spoke about property tax and rental income. So, how much of this is a story between different levels of government? Does this office only look at kind of central government taxation, or to what extent is it capturing local government, KCCA taxation? And I suppose, are we also seeing that shifting burden? You kind of spoke about the shift in where people are paying. We're seeing that across different government levels.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I have a couple of minutes to address all this, right? I'm not aware of time. Okay. Yes, thanks so much, Enock, for the discussion. I'll just say a few things about some comments you mentioned. Yes, one of the key limitations, I think, of this whole thing is that the list was set up once for all in 2015. URA is aware that that list needed to be updated. The potentials are there, which at some point need to be integrated. Still, as you said, now, 7 years later, 8 years later, there could be others, or some that left, that could be out of the category. That's just, as far as I know, it's not happening. That kind of flexibility in categorization. Of course, I'll provide more details on the tax enforcement on companies. And it's very difficult to have interviews with HNWIs and DAPs. Of course, that would be just ideal to do a survey of such individuals, but they are really up there. And even URA, to have a visit would just wait months to meet them and discuss. Tax exemptions, I'm not sure they would benefit much more than compared to the control group or the rest, but I'll double check. But that's a very good point. Yes, and all the other comments, thanks so much. There was a point on, on the tax base. Yeah, I think at the beginning it was a problem of just identifying such individuals which were not in the tax base at all. So the previous papers show that I think like 5 or 6 of such individuals were known to the URA. So at least that such identification effort helped widening the tax base for them. And yes, once they're in, the key challenge is to make them comply. There is lots of just blatant evasion there, even after registration. So yes, that's a good interpretation of all this. I could get some. I don't know how to answer your questions. I'll get some figures on how big they are. And yes, I'm pretty sure HNWIs are connected to international organizations as well. But I have to really double check. That's a very good point. On what the unit does in practice. Yeah, we had repeated interviews with the staff, with the managers, and because this never came up, but it's a possibility. It's also true that URA staff, most of them, they don't want to go in that unit because they don't want to have anything to do with such individuals, given the intricacies and the difficulty in just it's all very much delicate. So. Yeah, I didn't see much enthusiasm of staff in being there. I don't know if they looked honest to me, but that's a point I could definitely explore more. There was a point on what is the union looking at in terms of other governments. As far as I know, it was more about national taxes. The usual suspects like personal income tax and VAT, rental income as well. I didn't look much on what happens on other organizations. I know that they have access to data from CSAE to understand property ownership and indicators like that. But it's just a good point that I didn't look at, and I'll do, of course. So thanks. Thank you.
Good morning. I'll be presenting a paper that I've worked on with a colleague from the Economic Policy Research Center in the Nakato. The title is Fiscal Rules, the Challenges and Lessons During the COVID-19 Crisis in Uganda. Firstly, we know that it's not the wealthy who need the doctor, but the sick. And therefore, ensuring sustainable public finances is a top priority for a number of countries, and this has been demonstrated by the increase in the adoption of different measures to ensure that debts and public deficits remain sustainable. One of the common measures that countries have adopted is the development or adoption of fiscal rules, ideally mainly the numerical fiscal rules, which are long-lasting binding constraints on governments on setting limits on their fiscal deficits as well as their public debts to ensure that they remain sustainable. Now, for the case of Uganda, the adoption of these numerical fiscal rules, that's the fiscal rule on the public deficit and the public debt, are yet to improve the sustainability of our public finances. And most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has unprecedentedly affected a number of developed, middle-income, and low-income countries, which has put a lot of pressure on public finances and fiscal policy, with an increase in the number of interventions to cushion economies from the pandemic, but also to ensure that lives and livelihoods are sustained or protected. Relatedly, the pandemic emphasizes the need to examine and rethink the existing fiscal frameworks and policies to ensure sustainable public finances. And the pandemic also raises concerns about the functioning of fiscal institutions, especially regarding their capacity to manage fiscal and economic risks in a sustainable and coordinated manner. Why is this talk relevant and what is it about? Firstly, this talk is about the state of Uganda's public finances with a focus on fiscal rules. And Uganda, like other developing countries, is struggling with its debt and has also experienced growing fiscal deficits over the years. And so the results of this study are also relevant to other developing or African economies. And also want to take a stock of where we have come from as a country, that is before COVID, which I will call BC, and then where we are, that's during COVID. And then the policy motivation is that can the fiscal rules guide Uganda's efforts to finance its development aspirations and ensure sustainability, fiscal sustainability. The objectives of this study are three. The first objective is to document the systematic weaknesses in Uganda's current fiscal framework, but also look at the weaknesses in the protocol that establishes the East African Monetary Union. This is largely because the current fiscal rules were adopted by Uganda because Uganda is a member of the East African community, which desired to form a single currency area in 2024, and so it came up with a number of convergence criteria that will ensure that these countries enter the monetary union with at least sustainable public finances. So the other objective is to examine whether the numerical fiscal rules are optimal fiscal policy instruments. And in this, we want to look at whether whether the fiscal rules are able to achieve their objective or target in a way that is more effective or efficient than other alternative measures for ensuring sustainable public finances. But also, these numerical rules want to see whether they have had minimal unintended consequences. Lastly, our objective is to draw lessons and make proposals for reforming fiscal rules, the fiscal rules framework for Uganda in light of the pandemic, which can also be applied to other developing economies, or African economies to be exact. In this slide, one of the take-home can be that we can see is that the gap between our revenues and expenditures has been growing over the past 20 or so years. And the gap has widened more during the pandemic. As you can see, the pandemic period is the period after the dashed red line, and then has the DC above it. That's during COVID. You can notice that the gap between our revenues and our expenditures has greatly widened during this period, again emphasizing the fiscal pressure that has been exerted by the pandemic on Uganda. And then the black dotted line shows us the fiscal deficit, which has to be closed largely through borrowing. So the love for debt is not the root of all economic evils, but it might as well contribute to some of the economic evils and challenges that some of these developing countries, the case of Uganda, are still grappling with. As you can see, the debt has also been growing over the years, but I would like to point you to the period of 2006, 2007. Around that dent the dent in this graph is because we received multilateral debt relief from the IMF, the World Bank, and so we saw our debt reducing from 9.1 trillion Ugandan shillings to about 1.9 trillion, and it has grown over the years for a number of factors, but largely because of the increase in development aspirations, Uganda came up with a national development plan framework where we have these big investment projects that we try to invest in with the hope of ensuring socio-economic transformation. These have greatly resulted in borrowing, but also the political question is very critical because we noticed that a number of borrowing decisions that have been made have been influenced by politics and not the economics. So I want to have an overview of the fiscal rules framework in Uganda. Firstly, Uganda adopted 2 fiscal rules in 2013-14, and as earlier indicated, this was following the signing of the protocol establishing the East African Monetary Union. And this protocol had these 2 fiscal rules, that is the fiscal balance, including grants, is reduced to a deficit of 3% of GDP. And this fiscal deficit rule ideally plays a preventive role, whereby we are, as a country, are committing ourselves to make fiscal adjustments in terms of reducing our deficit in a sequential manner to ensure that our debt does not grow beyond sustainable limits. And then the public debt rule, which is calibrated in net present value terms, is that our public debt is maintained below the ratio of 50% of GDP, and this one plays a corrective role because this is the limit beyond which we don't expect our debt to grow. So in that, it makes sure that the government doesn't exceed that limit. Then we formally adopted these rules in 2015-16 after the establishment of the Public Finance Management Act and the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility. During this period, what we observe is that the government pursued ambitious social and economic transformation goals, which resulted in the increase in the expenditure, and we also observe lower than projected revenues and economic growth, which have implications for meeting the deficit rule, but also related to having limited fiscal space in case of a shock. During the pandemic, what we observe is that COVID-19 has put significant pressure on the government to cushion the economy from the effects of the pandemic, but also to support lives and livelihoods through a number of measures or interventions. And to do this, the government had to activate its escape clause, which permitted the government to deviate from the pre-announced path of the fiscal deficit rule that was ensuring that by 2020-21, the fiscal deficit rule should have been 3%. 3% of the fiscal deficit should have been 3% of our GDP. So the government took an effort in sustaining livelihoods, but also the economy by deviating from that rule. So during this period, the debt rule was the fiscal anchor. In other words, the decisions on whether we should borrow more or spend more were largely influenced by our debt rule. And then, because of those pressures, we find that there was an increase in expenditure and a slight reduction in tax revenues, as you observed from the previous graph. But during this period, after the old Charter for Fiscal Responsibility expired, the government came up with a new Charter for Fiscal Responsibility last year, and this now is focusing on 3 aspects. It focuses on the public debt, the fiscal deficit, and our petroleum funds. And now we have moved away from having only 2 fiscal rules to having 7 fiscal rules, which might be more complex and difficult for us to manage, but perhaps I'm speaking too soon because this is just the first year of implementing the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility. Some evidence on the performance of the fiscal deficit rule. As you can observe in BC period, the target for the government was that by 2020-21, our deficit should have been 3% of our GDP. But as you can see, it was over 9%. That is, of course, COVID could be a scapegoat, but there were underlying weaknesses in our fiscal frameworks that could also justify or that could explain why this deficit is at that level. And then looking at our public debt rule performance, we observe that our debt, we have been in line with our debt rule because it's, as you can see, the limit is above the actual performance. But what that might seem a good thing, but in effect, it's a bad thing because it made the government complacent. Because as long as you have fiscal headroom, you're always going to borrow more because you are sure that after all, you're going to remain within the limit that you set for yourself. So I think that we find that this limit was too high for the government, and as a consequence, we borrowed more basing on that. And of course, the metrics have been changing over time and could change in the coming years. Pardon. So what are some of the challenges that we find with Uganda's fiscal rules framework? Firstly, we'll start with the pre-pandemic challenges because it's important to understand where we have come from and where we are, to get a clear picture of where we are. So firstly, looking at the fiscal rules, the public debt rule was complex, calibrated in net present value terms. A number of the private sector actors, the public, and also some government officials always kept confusing that rule. Most of them would quote it in nominal terms whenever they were in the floor of parliament. Media houses were always saying the government is about to breach its rule because they did not understand this rule. That meant that compliance, monitoring compliance by the public and the private sector was also difficult for them. But related to that, these two rules provided contradictory signals. How? The fiscal deficit rule was telling us that, hey, we are trying to reduce our deficits, which would result into lower debt. But then you have a debt rule, a debt limit which is far above the debt that you have, right? So they're not supporting each other in any way. And then we also have we also observe a lack of commitment to the fiscal deficit rule in fiscal plans. Because ideally, government is supposed to come with annual fiscal plans that it's implementing over the fiscal period. But you find that in most of the background to the budget publications that our deficits were projected to be higher than they should have been during the time when we should be meeting our fiscal deficit target. And then regarding institutions, what we find is that Uganda lacks an independent fiscal institution that is tasked with monitoring compliance with the rules and also offering alternative forecasts on the path for fiscal aggregate. So you have the Ministry of Finance setting the fiscal rules, monitoring the fiscal rules, and of course, usually within government, there's always a political hand or political influence in how some of these things, some of these projections are made. Usually you want to provide an optimistic picture, or you want to provide a picture that you're doing well as a country, when in effect you're not. And then there's also limited fiscal capacity to accurately predict the future path of fiscal aggregates. And with this, we see that government always kept falling short of its predictions, and this has implications for credibility, especially for people who pay keen attention to some of the pronouncements by the government. Thirdly, there was an over-reliance on the debt sustainability analysis results to inform borrowing decisions. Uganda uses the low-income country debt sustainability framework that was developed by the International Monetary Fund, and because of projections using this framework, the results have consistently shown that in a 20-year period or over a 20-year horizon, our debt will be sustainable. What this has made the government do is it has made it complacent, always thinking that it is still safe. It is still safe. After all, the results show that our debt is sustainable, and as a consequence, we have been taking on more and more debt. Lastly, looking at the protocol through which we obtain these fiscal rules, the protocol had weak incentives for compliance at regional and the national level, and also we do not have, the East African community does not have a surveillance and coordination system, which means that in case of any shock on any of these economies or on all these economies, you will not have a coordinated response or reaction to how you address any of the fiscal challenges that you might be grappling with. What are some of the pandemic challenges with the fiscal rules as a result of the pandemic? Firstly, we see that there was an uncoordinated fiscal response to the pandemic by East African community member countries. Now, these are countries that are committing themselves to these rules to ensure that they enter, they form a single currency area by 2024, right? So ideally, if you are committing yourselves to those rules, in case of any shock, it means you should agree on measures to be taken, either to deviate from the rule, because the commitment was that by 2020-21, we should be meeting these fiscal rules, and then give ourselves a space of 3 years, and then then start with the single currency area. But if every country is doing what it wills, Uganda is saying we are deviating from the rule for four more years. That means the public is unsure of when this single currency union will take off. And then relatedly, with the fiscal rules, what we see is that government has set unrealistic targets for the public deficit and public debt during this pandemic by historical and pandemic standards, because it's overly ambitious and it wants to communicate a signal to the development partners and the private sector that it is committed to ensuring that debt is sustainable. And we also find that the escape clause in the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility is not clear, and neither is it credible for the government to follow through strongly. There were delays in developing a credible timeline and procedures to revert to the fiscal deficit rule. As you can see, between June 2020, in June, the commitment was that by 2020-24, we should have met the rule, and then government kept revising it based on optimism around and the behavior of the economy in response to the pandemic. What are some of the lessons we draw from the COVID-19 pandemic? Firstly, commitment to numerical fiscal targets should be complemented by a credible deficit and debt reduction strategy. It's not enough to say that we want our debt to remain within these limits, but not come up with details on how you are going to ensure that happens or takes place. And then countries need to set clear timelines and procedures for reverting to rule compliance. When government indicated that it's deviating from the rule, it did not initially set timelines, but also highlight what measures it was going to take to ensure that we revert to the rule. And then developing a sound and clear communication strategy is critical for anchoring expectations about the deficit and debt sustainability, and also establishing a regional fiscal coordination secretariat or authority could improve coordination of fiscal policy actions, because Uganda is intent on joining a single currency area with other East African community countries. Therefore, it is important not only to focus on monetary aggregates, but also on the fiscal aggregates and their coordination. Activating escape clauses is critical to ensuring flexibility due to the pandemic shock, but this privilege is likely to be overused by governments, especially if they are reluctant on establishing the timelines. How do we conclude? Fiscal discipline is essential for fiscal and debt sustainability. For the case of Uganda, the fiscal framework needs to be strengthened and less politicized. And secondly, the inherent weaknesses in the protocol for the establishment of the East African Monetary Union has translated into defects on the national fiscal framework for Uganda. And third, for the case of Uganda, fiscal rules are yet to enhance fiscal discipline and reduce uncertainty about the future path of fiscal policy. And then the pandemic has also provided important lessons. As I conclude, what are the possible alternatives for the government and other actors? From the fiscal rules front, we need to develop a clear communication strategy to inform the public and the private sector about the design and implementation of fiscal rules. Secondly, we need to develop a clear and practical debt reduction strategy. We need to set fiscal targets that are realistic by historic and pandemic standards. And regarding institutions, we need to push efforts to create an independent institution that will monitor and assess the implementation of fiscal rules, but also provide alternative fiscal variable forecasts. And I recommend Economic Policy Research Center, which is National Planning Authority and Civil Budget Advocacy Group, which are critical in this environment. We need to strengthen the budget process to ensure that our fiscal plans are in line with the fiscal rules that we have set. It makes no sense to come up with a fiscal rule that the budgets are not going to be linked or aligned with. And then we need to take a holistic view of the public debt sustainability, escape from the public debt safety trap. Again, as earlier indicated, using the IMF debt sustainability framework has made developing countries like Uganda less compliant. And then lastly, we need to address the weaknesses in the governance framework of the East African Monetary Union. Lastly, is COVID-19 a scapegoat for the state of public finances in African economies? I don't know. Perhaps you have the answers. Well, since this is a Center for the Study of African Economies conference, I wanted to also mention something about Africa. The period, we can't for sure tell when the pandemic will pass, but we know that if the future of our public finances is not different from what we've been doing, things could likely turn out worse. And we know that we want the future to be different from the past. Therefore, we must leverage COVID-19 pandemic to rethink our approach to using fiscal rules as guides for pursuing our development aspirations sustainably. And we can never have the African economies we want if we don't have the Africans we want. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, thank you so much, Enock, for this great piece of research and very insightful presentation. I have three main comments, I guess, and some things that I may share bilaterally. So the first is, this is a very insightful piece of research, and it focuses exclusively on Uganda. And I think it might be perhaps relevant since a lot of countries around the world face COVID, and I think a lot of African countries are on the same boat. I think it would perhaps be insightful even for extensions of this research to mention neighboring countries like perhaps Kenya or Rwanda, those that are also part of the East African Monetary Union. So that's my first comment. My second comment is I felt like there was perhaps an inherent contradiction in the presentation and the paper, which I think, so it boils down to the fact that making the argument that fiscal discipline was perhaps weak in Uganda, yet at the same time there was this chart showing that the net present value of debt was still below the fiscal rules that the government set for itself. And while I think that, while I agree that, okay, perhaps greater fiscal headroom will prompt a lack of compliance with the debt rule in the long run, I think perhaps we can mention some external measures of fiscal sustainability. So, for example, credit ratings by the big three, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, or Moody's, or, for example, other metrics within the Article 4s of the IMF in the Uganda report, or even sovereign risk premium, for example. So what do markets think? What are they pricing in for the long-term fiscal trajectory of Uganda? And finally, I think for further pieces of research, I think it would be nice to have some sort of quantification. So zooming into a stronger rhetoric towards causal interpretation. So, for example, you make the argument that there's a need for independent fiscal monitoring institutions, for example. I think it would be very nice if we compare, for example, within African countries or the East African Monetary Union, for example, countries that do set up an independent fiscal monitoring monitoring institution, and perhaps see what this means for the long-term trajectory of debt or the long-term trajectory of Uganda's or different African countries' fiscal trajectory. So with that, I open the floor for questions and comments. Thank you so much again, Enock.
Maybe we can take one or two questions.
Yeah, hi. Very nice paper. I was just thinking about listening to you that there's like a potential political economy angle that you can maybe think about bringing in as well. So it's a really nice paper from Elbadri, Kenya, something like that. She's at Margaryta, and Sam Hickey, who's at Manchester. And they look at the declining ability of the ministry of finance to control the budgetary process and the increasing political capture of finance ministry processes, and you might like to think about whether this kind of research reflects some of those dynamics as well in the country, and whether there's like this could be like a case study of that kind of process, or just some angle of political economy as well. I can send you a link to the paper.
Thank you. Well, yes, please.
So you had an interesting little comment about debt sustainability analysis there, I thought. I think the thing about that is it's got stress tests in it to see whether the country is going to stay sustainable if there's a shock. But the ability to weather a shock is not captured very well in those two targets. And I think if you were to compare Uganda with some of its neighbours, like Kenya or India, for example, it's kind of done what it wanted, so it's been quite moderate in its deficits until there was a crisis, and then it had some room to have some really big deficits for a couple of years. It's kind of what you want. But obviously, you have to bust the target to do what you want in the crisis. So maybe just those two variables aren't enough. But I think it's worth thinking about whether the debt sustainability analysis stress tests are really captured properly in a limited number of targets like that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your comments and questions. Yes, again, this is the study that can be taken further to look at other African economies, specifically also looking at the East African community, like the suggestion you made on Kenya. And then I think the inherent contradictions that you see in the paper, it's something that we also see, because if you have a fiscal deficit rule that is not supporting or that is not supported by the deficit rule, then you always have these contradictions. And then clearly, quantification is something that needs to be taken on, because it sends a stronger signal as well if you're trying to have a discussion with the policymakers. Thank you for the idea on incorporating the political economy aspect. It's very critical. And then the issue with the IMF's low-income debt framework is that most of these developing countries, case of Uganda, is we overly rely on that as the only measure for whether our debts are sustainable or not. But there are other indicators that we need to look to. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Selim Elbadri. I'm a PhD student in economics at the University of Nottingham, and today I'll present my paper, A Services-Led Growth Escalator. Okay, in terms of where this paper is coming from, so there's this long-held view that the manufacturing sector is critical for closing the cross-country income gap. In other words, manufacturing serves as a growth escalator. Proponents of this view cite that the manufacturing sector is able to absorb a large number of unskilled labor within populations, and is also a sound absorbent of the latest technologies, of the frontier, of course. More recently, however, there's this observation that came about, Roderick 2016, Journal of Economic Growth, citing premature deindustrialization, namely that many countries in the developing world are essentially skipping manufacturing and moving straight from agriculture to services. Against this backdrop, the research question of this paper is, can services replace manufacturing as a growth escalator? In terms of the outline of the paper, so I begin by documenting 3 motivational facts on services productivity growth. This is average productivity growth between 1975 and 2009. The first fact is that there is greater variance among emerging markets and developing economies in productivity growth in services vis-a-vis advanced economies. Second, much of this is driven by the within channel. So this refers to subsector innovations or increases in productivity levels. rather than a reallocation effect. So it's not that, for example, labor is within services is moving from slow-growing to fast-growing subsectors. And finally, there's evidence of conditional convergence in services. And what this means is that once I control for country-specific factors, countries further away from the frontier will grow faster. Next, I build a model that is consistent with these facts. So I'm going to have a standard neoclassical growth model. I'm focusing exclusively on a one-sector model to stay in line with the within fact. So that's fact number 2. And I'm going to introduce a twist that the planner is going to choose the per unit investment returns. And I'll be clearer about this in the model section of the presentation. In the transition, growth will be governed by a catch-up effect, the investment rate, and technology absorbing efficiency. And again, I'll be more specific about this shortly. I run several counterfactual exercises. The main takeaway that I would like you to leave this room with is that productivity growth jumps from an average of 3.6% to 18.7% among developing economies once I reassign sample maximum investment rates and technology absorbing facilities. In other words, technology absorbing facilities and investment rates are critical for driving up productivity growth in services for developing economies. Jumping into the facts, so I use the 10-sector Groningen Growth and Development Center database. That gives me a panel data of 42 countries between 1975 and 2009, with sectoral level real value added and nominal value added, as well as employment. Services here will simply refer to the sum of activities in transport, trade, business, government, and personal services, and services productivity here is simply defined as the ratio of real value added over employment. Fact number 1, emerging markets and developing economies typically show a greater variance in average productivity growth in services compared to advanced economies. On the x-axis here, I have log 2009 real GDP per capita as a proxy for the level of development. On the y-axis, I have average productivity growth in services between 1975 to 2009. The countries in red are the emerging markets and developing economies, and you can see that they are far more dispersed compared to the countries in green. And these are the advanced economies. Advanced economies typically grow between 0 and 3%, whereas emerging markets and developing economies, you have very fast growing countries, roughly 4 and 5% on average, and you have countries that are contracting. And again, this is reinforced by the variance. So you can see that the variance for the developing countries is 5, whereas the variance for the advanced economies is 1.06. A key takeaway from this chart is that it further reinforces the motivation behind this paper. Namely, if countries are moving prematurely to services and skipping manufacturing, then countries can end up with an equilibrium of very large and dominant services sectors with very low or even contracting productivity. Now, a key question that comes from this chart is what are behind these productivity growth dynamics? Namely, is it a within channel where the different subsectors are driving innovations and increases in productivity levels? Or is it, for example, that the fast-growing countries are growing because labor is moving from slow-growing subsectors and services to fast-growing subsectors and services? I run a decomposition exercise a la Macmillan and Roderick. On the left-hand side, I have the increase in productivity in services between 1975 and 2009. On the right-hand side, the first term is the within channel. So that is keeping employment shares in services fixed. How much of the productivity increase in services is driven by increases in subsector productivity levels. Okay. The second term on the right-hand side is the between channel. So that's the opposite. So I'm fixing productivity levels within the subsectors, but looking at evolutions in employment shares within services. And once I run this decomposition, I get the result below here, which tells me that 98% of the increase in productivity in services is driven by the within channel. Namely, that in order to understand productivity growth dynamics, one must look at within subsector increases in productivity. Again, I complement this with a nice chart here. So on the x-axis, I have average growth in services labor productivity. On the y-axis, I have the share of the productivity increase between 1975 and 2009 driven by the within channel on the left and the between channel on the right. You can see that virtually all the countries across the entire spectrum,
the within channel is the most dominant force behind productivity growth dynamics across both developing countries and advanced ones. Now, what are behind these within changes in productivity levels? I borrow from the growth empirics literature and test if there is some convergence story going on. Using the same specifications as Roderick 2013, I first test for unconditional convergence. So on the left-hand side, I have average productivity growth in services. And on the right-hand side, I have the beta coefficient here, which is the coefficient of interest, because it corresponds to the initial productivity level. So the initial the log of initial productivity levels in services. And this is at the subsectoral level, these regressions. Next, I test for conditional convergence, where I condition on country-specific factors, okay, through the use of country-fixed effects. In other words, the interpretation from the second regression is if countries further away from the frontier grow faster once I condition for country-specific factors. Indeed, when I run these regressions, I find that while there's a negative beta coefficient across all four specifications, it is only statistically significant in the third and fourth columns. And these are indeed where I include the country-fixed effects. The first two columns test for unconditional convergence. Columns 3 and 4 test for conditional convergence. The key takeaway from this chart, from this regression table, is that there's evidence of conditional convergence. Namely, countries further away from the frontier are going to grow faster in terms of productivity levels in services once I condition for country-fixed effects. 3 facts, just to recap thus far. The first is that there is a higher or greater dispersion in average productivity growth in services across developing economies vis-a-vis advanced ones. Second, productivity growth dynamics in services are driven by the within channel, so increases in productivity levels within the different subsectors of services. And finally, there's evidence of conditional convergence. So countries further away from the frontier will grow faster once I condition for these country-specific factors. Onto the model. So, as I promised in the introduction, I have a standard neoclassical growth model where I'm simply maximizing utility here, which takes a log consumption specification. And this is subject to the resource constraint, which says that YT, which is my output, is either being consumed, CT, or invested through ZT. And this already hints at a standard consumption investment trade-off that we observe in the Ramsey model, for instance. And then there's, on the production side, I have a linear production technology where I have a one-to-one mapping between YT, which is output, and AT, which is the level of domestic technology. This is the only input that goes into the production function. So how does this level of domestic technology evolve over time? So like any other law of motion, it takes its input physical investment, which is represented by ZT, and it nets out depreciation. So the depreciation rate here is governed by delta, and delta is set to be country and time invariant. So all countries at all periods face the same depreciation rate. Now, a key thing to note here is that this investment is, the return per unit of investment is determined or governed by gamma, and the capital gamma here. And this is where the static problem or the allocation of physical investment comes in. And this is a key innovation of this paper. So what happens here, and this is the bottom row, the social planner has to maximize the return per unit of investment by choosing to allocate physical investment across two competing technologies. Within the square brackets, you have the first set of round brackets, that's A bar minus A, and that corresponds to the distance of the frontier. So A bar is the level of foreign or the frontier technology level. A is the level of domestic technology. So A bar minus A simply corresponds to an output gap or the level of, or the distance to the frontier. On the other side, you have this eta term, and this corresponds to a constant returns to scale technology return. And again, this is constant across countries over time. Omega is what the social planner decides. So this is what the social planner decides. And that is simply a distribution parameter. So it determines how much of the ZT goes to the catch-up return per unit of investment, or the constant returns to scale technology per unit of investment return. Crucially, and to maintain consistency with the empirical facts, I interact the catch-up term with this growth efficiency term. And this growth efficiency term you can think of as the theoretical analog of the country fixed effects. Okay, so it captures structural characteristics that vary across countries, but not over time. And here I simply set A bar, so the level of frontier technology, to evolve at a rate of GA bar, and this is fixed. In terms of the technology choice, so we first solve for the static problem. So how does the social planner choose to allocate the physical investment across the two competing technologies? So what this says here is that if I'm very far away from the frontier, in other words, if there's a huge output gap, I assign all of my physical investment to a catch-up technology. However, if I'm very close to the frontier, even if I'm not quite the frontier, but I'm very close, take for example Denmark, I prefer a constant returns to scale technology. Why? Because I'm very close to the frontier that allocating my physical investment to the catch-up technology will not yield high enough returns. Okay? So already from this, we can see what the intertemporal solution will look like. We're going to have a catch-up phase, and you can think of this as the transitional dynamics. Okay, and as I prefer the catch-up technology over time, I get closer and closer to the frontier until eventually the social planner decides to switch to a constant returns to scale technology. And once it does so, it grows on a balanced growth path at a constant rate thereafter. And indeed, this is what is reflected from these two law of motions. So equation number one here is the evolution of domestic technology in the transitional dynamics, or in the transition phase. I call this the catch-up phase, where you can see that there are three key growth drivers of productivity. The first is ZT, which is physical investment. The second is A bar minus A, which is this catch-up, these gains from the catch-up. And finally, this gamma term, which is a growth efficiency level. And again, this growth efficiency level, you can think of as the country fixed effects in the empirical, in the motivational facts. Equation 2 says that on the balanced growth path, so remember, as I get closer and closer, my catch-up marginal gains are getting smaller and smaller until eventually I go on a balanced growth path because I've already reached a point that is close enough to the frontier, and therefore I grow at a constant rate governed by equation 2. Okay, so now I'm in a position where I can bring the model to the data through a calibration exercise. So in terms of calibration, I won't go into that many details. All I will say is that I have to rely on the world input-output tables, because I can, not only does this allow me to focus on the services economy and essentially allow me to extract value added, but it also allows me to extract consumption and investment value added in services. And to do this, I follow Herendorf and co-authors, and you have to compute a total requirements matrix. But I won't get into that. Details are in the paper. But the key thing that I would like to highlight from the calibration results is that I can calibrate the growth efficiency parameter to match output growth in services between 2000 and 2005 using the catch-up law of motion. So take several examples here. So in the first column, I have output growth. Second column is initial output. So that's the starting point, and this is normalized to the US. Then the initial investment rate, and finally the growth efficiency parameter. The takeaway here is that, say for example, India has a very high growth efficiency level. The reason it does so is because it managed to grow even despite a very low investment rate. I think it's in fact one of the lowest investment rates in the sample. Brazil, on the other hand, had a positive investment rate and yet saw an average contraction between 2000 and 2005, hence its very low growth efficiency level. With these calibration results, I can run a variance decomposition exercise. So remember, the first fact said that the productivity growth dynamics in services are very dispersed within developing economies. I can actually run a variance decomposition using the law of motion for the catch-up phase, and I get these results. So in terms of the individual variances, I find that the variation in ZT alone drives 17.7% of the variation observed in productivity growth in services. In terms of the covariances, I get that the covariance between the growth efficiency level and the investment rate, and the covariance between the investment rate and initial output dictate almost 50% of the variation in productivity growth in services. Counterfactual number 1. So I explore here how can developing countries boost their services productivity growth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my subsample of developing countries and I will assign one by one the sample maximum growth efficiency level, the sample maximum distance to the frontier, and the sample maximum investment rate. Remember, these are the 3 key growth drivers of productivity growth in services according to my model. Okay, beginning with the first column. So this is the observed growth rate. You can see that the average growth rate across developing countries between 2000 and 2005 was 3.6%. In column number 2, I assign all of the countries the same maximum growth efficiency level, but I allow each country to vary in their distance to the frontier and investment rate. And once I do so, I see that productivity growth on average jumps from 3.6% to 11.3%. Column number 3, I assign all countries the sample maximum growth efficiency level and investment rate, and I allow each country to vary in their distance to the frontier. And once I do so, I find that average productivity growth increases from 11.3% to 18.7%. And the final column is assigning all the countries the sample maximum growth efficiency level, distance to the frontier, and investment rate. And I find, and I interpret this to be this, the maximum potential growth rate, and I see that it jumps to 21%. But the key takeaway from here is that the increase or the distance between the observed average growth rate and the maximum potential growth rate, 86% of this distance is covered by the growth efficiency level and investment rates. Okay? So average productivity growth jumps from 3.6% to 18.7% once countries improve their growth efficiency levels and their investment rates in services. The catch-up effect plays a minor role in determining growth dynamics in services. And just to conclude, so I have my second counterfactual exercise where I zoom into this growth efficiency level and understand the implications of this on convergence times. What I do is I take my sample of 5 developing countries, I assign them the same starting point. Okay, so that's the same distance to the frontier and the same investment rate, but I allow each country to vary in their growth efficiency level. And once I do so, I can plot convergence times against the US, and I consider the US to be my frontier here. India, for example, has the highest growth efficiency level of 1.669 according to my calibration results, and therefore converges to the frontier in simply 8 time periods. You can think of this as 8 years. Brazil, on the other hand, which has the lowest growth efficiency level, converges in 16 time periods. So automatically, I can see that a lot of the convergence results that I've seen in my motivational facts can be understood through the growth efficiency levels. These growth efficiency levels have major implications for convergence times and the long-term trajectory of productivity growth in services. I realize I'm out of time, so just two quick words. So, can services replace manufacturing as a growth escalator? The short answer is no. If I compare this to the results in Roderick, I think it is 2013, he finds unconditional convergence in manufacturing. I find this is not the case in services, that services productivity dynamics are governed by conditional convergence. So you have to have the right combination of country-specific factors to grow your services productivity. Does this mean that the aggregate cross-country income gap is going to persist in the long run? Not necessarily. Countries need to increase their investment rates in services and improve their growth efficiency levels. And future research should understand the components of this growth efficiency level. Thank you very much.
All right. So, great. First of all, I have to say it's I'm not an expert of this topic. I learned so much, and I'm grateful for having had this opportunity. It's a very original work on such understated topic. I really appreciate the methodology that you implied and all the different robustness checks that you put in the appendix. They were extremely original. And also, I particularly appreciate the policy implications that your work has, especially when it comes to discussing, issues around waste, congestions, and distortions. Sorry. So the main findings, as you just said, is that overseas UK offices spend much more at the end of the UK fiscal year. Such effect increases when the host country's fiscal year overlaps with the UK's ones. And the last finding is that overseas offices spending increase later in the fiscal years of local firms. So there is also this additional effect. And as you said, this is still work in progress. So it's I'm sure it will get more and more improved. I just have very few comments. One is more at the conceptual level. Again, I'm not an expert of this, but I just felt like you were doing some sort of leap, an intellectual conceptual leap from discussing mere fiscal year ending spending decisions, the reporting decision, and jumping to discussions around crowding out and congestion effects. I'm sure there is a link there. It's just that I was missing it when reading the paper. My feeling was that, yes, you were mostly looking at budgetary fiscal year end and that the impact of that on spending. But then what about evidence on crowding out effects and congestions? And this links, of course, to my comments around the results. Yes, first question is whether you can show what happens to other government entities spending. Can you really show a crowding out effects on other countries' overseas offices? Of course, it's a data issue, and I guess it could be just amazing if you could have the same data from the US and show what happens to those overseas offices. Another point I wanted to make a question was more about how much are the spikes in spending due to price effect rather to the quantity effect. I think you mentioned it you mentioned you did a separate work on this, but yeah, I was just unsure what's happening there. Another point was instead more related to the country's suppliers' competitive environment. How does that matter for the results that you're having? And are you assuming anything around that? And there is, I don't know why this. Yeah, there are a couple of more comments around the policy implications, which also links to the results. But anyway, so again, can you say something about waste? I'm not sure you have access to which type of spending is done apart from resource versus capital. Yes, there is a spike, but are we totally sure that is it wasteful or it's just what it is? It could be necessary spending. Can you get extra information around the different categories of spending? And then you also mentioned that you contribute to literature on taxation policies spillovers. I would love to learn more about that, but yeah, just for more broadly. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I have two, but feel free to answer either. I was wondering if you could comment on that. I think I heard about 60% of countries that share the fiscal year with the UK. Like, are they all former colonies? Or is that completely random? Does that affect? Anyway, and also, how this local firms, how is that defined? Like, are kind of British multinationals overseas local firms, or I've done some project. PwC South Africa were deemed a local firm by FC, and I remember finding out a lot. So I was wondering if you could comment on this.
Thank you so much for those comments, and thanks so much, Fabrizio, for thinking about the paper. So what happens in other countries? Yeah, that's a challenge because we only can see what happens to overseas offices. So we don't have information that happens in many other countries. We could potentially link it to one of countries that we have, like Ukraine. We could have a look into this, but then we only have 10 years, so we only have a very small number of data. I'm not sure how much we could draw out of it. But that's potentially something we might want to look into this a bit deeper. That's a good idea. Price versus quantity, yeah, very difficult to separate. We only have spending amounts. We do not know what they're spending it on. So that's information that wasn't given to us, unfortunately, but it would be very nice to separate. From our previous work, I can say that the majority of the effect is driven by quantities. So they spend a lot, they post a lot more tenders in the last months of fiscal year, but there is also some price effect where they strategically increase their prices. Then there was a question on, I think, sorry, environment, sorry. Oh, supplies competitive environment, yes. So that's something we're just trying to infer, meaning that if fiscal years overlap, meaning that everyone has to close his budget right now, so that all of them just spend money at the same time, which means that they compete for the same supplies simultaneously for the same supplies for similar goods and services. So again, that's not something we can directly observe, but that's, I think it's a reasonable assumption to make. Maybe we can do, we can revisit the paper and see whether we can do a better job out of it. Waste, so we can see increase in spending. We cannot directly test what's the proportion of waste, and that's a very big challenge. In terms of whether this waste can be good, well, the literature suggests that it's not, because the amount they spend it on are quite ridiculous. 20% of the annual budget spent in the last month. And if you look at what they spend it on, it's usually like computers, chairs, office equipment, like MacBooks. And there's Bulime and Mahoney paper published in the AR looking at the quality of that spending. And what they find is that the quality of the spending is actually much lower in the last week of the fiscal year than otherwise would. So there is some evidence of it, but we cannot tackle exactly because, again, we do not know what they're buying. Yeah, literature and taxation, I think that's fair enough. That's something we put it as a secondary contribution. We try to say how we contribute, but that's something that definitely can elaborate on. Thank you. Going back to your two questions, so countries, we looked at the countries that were overlaps are not colonies. So Japan, for example, is one of them. So there is no clear link why they would have the same fiscal ends. In terms of the firms, we look at the firms that sort of have their, I think something called like, that they appear on the stock exchange. So there is sort of, it might not be representative, obviously, of all firms in the country, but that's something we're just trying to infer. This is probably the best we could do, given that in different countries there are different rules. So in some rules, firms and government fiscal year is the same. In some countries, firms are allowed to pick their fiscal year reporting. So it's very hard to pick up on this, and the best thing also we could do is a Bloomberg data. But if you have any other data sources, I'll be very glad to hear about that. Thank you.
Where shall we put, like, behind? Oh, no, let's